Good morning, everyone. My name is Ben Rottenborn, and together with Elaine and Adam, I represent Amber Heard. In a few minutes, Elaine will get up here and she'll introduce you to Amber. And she'll address the allegations that you just heard in Mr. Chu and Ms. Vasquez's opening statement. And she'll explain to you why all those inflammatory things are things that are designed to mislead you from the truth. She'll explain to you what the evidence will show. And that's something that we're going to focus on in this trial, not attempts to distract you. We're going to focus on the evidence. Not what we wish the evidence showed, not some crazy conspiracy theories, but what the evidence and the facts actually show. And as you assess the evidence in this trial, I would ask that you keep one question in mind above all else, which is this: why are you here? What are you being asked to decide? You're being asked to decide a very simple question. And that question is, were the words that Amber used in the December 18th, 2018 opinion piece that was published in the Washington Post protected free speech under the First Amendment or not? That is the question, and that's what you're being asked to decide. At the end of the trial, the judge will explain to you what the law is on defamation and what Mr. Depp's burden is to prove in order to establish defamation. And she'll tell you a lot of things about the law. But among them, she will tell you that Mr. Depp will have to prove that the words Ms. Heard used were about him and that they were false. And if he can't do that, and if he can't meet the other elements of the claim, then he loses that claim. And he can't do that. He can't come close to doing that. And for that reason, you're going to hear, in this trial, Mr. Depp's team is going to make it about trying to distract you from that very simple question. Mr. Depp's team is going to try to turn this case into a soap opera. Why? I'm not really sure, because the evidence isn't pretty for Mr. Depp. It's not. You're going to see who the real Johnny Depp is. Behind the red carpets, behind the fame, behind the money, behind the pirate costumes, you're going to see who that man really is. Amber is going to tell you about it. You're going to hear who he really is from other witnesses. And you're going to hear who he really is in his own words, in the vile, graphic, terrible messages that he wrote about Amber and ways he used to describe Amber and what he wanted to do to Amber from the earliest days that they were dating, through their marriage, and after their marriage. You're going to hear about that. But this case isn't about that. This case isn't about a day-to-day chronicle of their marriage. It's not about who is the better spouse. It's not about who you like more. It's not about which party can sling more mud. But you're going to hear a lot of that in this trial. You're going to hear that because that's what Mr. Depp wants to turn this case into. He wants to turn this case into a 6-week-long public spectacle of the most intimate aspects of their relationship and their marriage. And you know what? I'm sorry for that. I'm sorry. I'm sorry that we're going to have to do that. I'm sorry that you're going to have to listen to all of it. And I'm sorry that Amber's going to have to relive that. But that's the case that Johnny Depp chose to bring. And we're not going to stand idly by and let him sling mud at our client and make inflammatory and false statements like you just heard in opening and not let those go unresponded to. But ultimately, what this case is about the First Amendment, about that December 18th, 2018 op-ed piece, and whether Ms. Heard's freedom of speech and the First Amendment give her the right to say the words that she said. That right, that freedom of speech, is what Amber Heard is asking you to uphold and protect in this lawsuit. And that's a very simple question. It's a question you could decide this afternoon. And it does not require you to stand and serve as the umpire of 2 movie stars' imperfect marriage. It doesn't. And so we're going to focus on those words. We're going to look at those words. And as we look at those words, I'd ask you to keep this in mind. Keep in mind what you just saw on the screen from Mr. Chu when he put up those words. keep in mind what you didn't see. You didn't see the rest of the opinion piece. And what we'd ask is that as you look at those words, that you look at them in the context of the piece in which they were written. Now, whether you look at them individually or in the context of the piece doesn't really matter because the words are true. But context matters. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask Heather to put up the article, put up the opinion piece, and I'm going to read that to you. And we're going to look at those words in the context of what this piece was about. Because Mr. Depp's team wants to make you think that this opinion piece was designed to destroy Johnny Depp. That this was designed to maliciously talk about him and their life together. And it wasn't. So let's take a moment to look at this. And I'm going to read it to you, and I'd ask that you follow along if you can. But either way, let's take a look at what the piece as a whole says. This is the piece that Amber wrote. I was exposed to abuse at a very young age. I knew certain things early on without ever having to be told. I knew that men have the power, physically, socially, and financially, and that a lot of institutions support that arrangement. I knew this long before I had the words to articulate it, and I bet you learned it young too. Like many women, I had been harassed and sexually assaulted by the time I was of college age, but I kept quiet. I did not expect filing complaints to bring justice, and I didn't see myself as a victim. Then, 2 years ago, I became a public figure representing domestic abuse, and I felt the full force of our culture's wrath for women who speak out. Friends and advisors told me I would never again work as an actress, that I would be blacklisted. A movie I was attached to recast my role. I had just shot a 2-year campaign as the face of a global fashion brand, and the company dropped me. Questions arose as to whether I would be able to keep my role of Mira in the movies Justice League and Aquaman. I had the rare vantage point of seeing, in real time, how institutions protect men accused of abuse. Imagine a powerful man as a ship, like the Titanic. That ship is a huge enterprise. When it strikes an iceberg, there are a lot of people on board desperate to patch up holes, not because they believe in or even care about the ship, but because their own fates depend on the enterprise. In recent years, the Me Too movement has taught us about how power like this works, not just in Hollywood, but in all kinds of institutions, workplaces, places of worship, or simply in particular communities. In every walk of life, women are confronting these men who are buoyed by social, economic, and cultural power, and these institutions are beginning to change. We are in a transformative political moment. The president of our country has been accused by more than a dozen women of sexual misconduct, including assault and harassment. Outrage over his statements and behavior has energized a female-led opposition. Me Too started a conversation about just how profoundly sexual violence affects women in every area of our lives. And last month, more women were elected to Congress than ever in our history, with a mandate to take women's issues seriously. Women's rage and determination to end sexual violence are turning into a political force. We have an opening now to bolster and build institutions protective of women. For starters, Congress can reauthorize and strengthen the Violence Against Women Act. First passed in 1994, the act is one of the most effective pieces of legislation enacted to fight domestic violence and sexual assault. It creates support systems for people who report abuse and provides funding for rape crisis centers, legal assistance programs, and other critical services. It improves responses by law enforcement, and it prohibits discrimination against LGBTQ survivors. Funding for the act expired in September and has only been temporarily extended. We should continue to fight sexual assault on college campuses, while simultaneously insisting on fair processes for adjudicating complaints. Last month, Education Secretary Betsy DeVos proposed changes to Title IX rules governing the treatment of sexual harassment and assault in schools. While some changes would make the process for handling complaints more fair, others would weaken protections for sexual assault survivors. For example, the new rules would require schools to investigate only the most extreme complaints, and then only when they are made to designated officials. Women on campuses already have trouble coming forward about sexual violence. Why would we allow institutions to scale back supports? I write this as a woman who had to change my phone number weekly because I was getting death threats. For months, I rarely left my apartment. And when I did, I was pursued by camera drones and photographers on foot, on motorcycles and in cars. Tabloid outlets that posted pictures of me spun them in a negative light. I felt as though I was on trial in the court of public opinion, and my life and livelihood depended on myriad judgments far beyond my control. I want to ensure that women who come forward to talk about violence receive more support. We are electing representatives who know how deeply we care about these issues. We can work together to demand changes to laws and rules and social norms, and to right the imbalances that have shaped our lives. I know that was a lot, but that is the central issue in this case. Are those words that Amber wrote, are those protected by the First Amendment? And the answer is very clearly yes. So let's talk about that article for a minute. First of all, the article doesn't mention Depp by name. It never once contains his name in that article. It is not about Amber's relationship with Mr. Depp. There are no details of any abuse in that article. The article is about proposed legislation and strengthening of government laws and policies designed to protect abuse victims and people who report abuse. That's what the article is about. And it was written in the midst of a social movement in which the American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU, asked Amber to use her platform to speak on these important issues. And that's what she did. To do so, she drew on her experiences as someone who had reported domestic abuse. And there's no question, there is no dispute that she did in fact report domestic abuse in 2016. Depp's side admits that. She talked about her negative personal experiences and her reactions and opinions after being someone in Hollywood who reported abuse and the consequences that flowed from that. She talked about what she experienced in the days and months following reporting that abuse. That's what the article is about. The article isn't about Johnny Depp. The article is about the social change for which she is advocating and that the First Amendment protects. And so I hope you remember, as this case goes on, that you saw from Mr. Chu only the 3 statements in isolation, because they want you to forget that. They don't want you to pay attention to what the article is about. Now, if it had been Amber's intention to use this article to detail the abuse that she suffered and that you'll hear about over the course of this trial, believe me, the article would have looked very, very different. She could fill a book with those details. She probably would have started out by calling out Mr. Depp by name. She probably wouldn't have published it in the Washington Post. She would have described in great detail the man who has described himself, the violent side of himself, as the monster. That's what she would have done. The monster. She would have told you about the monster. But she didn't. That wasn't the point of this article. And she was careful to avoid that, even having her lawyer review the article to make sure that it was okay. And she relied on that lawyer's advice, and you'll hear testimony on that during the trial. But because Johnny Depp brought this case and asked for it, all of that is going to come out. Just know that Amber Heard never wanted to unearth for the public who the real Johnny Depp is. But that's going to come out over the course of this trial. I'd like you to also take into consideration who isn't here today. You don't see the Washington Post sitting here as a defendant in this courtroom. Depp didn't sue the Washington Post. He had no interest in doing that. He only sued Amber. He could have sued the Washington Post. They published the article, but he didn't. And he chose to bring Amber to court here in Virginia, where she has no ties, has never lived, he's never lived, where they never spent any time, because he wanted to make her life hard. He wanted to ruin her life. He wanted to destroy her. That's what he did. And I wish I could say that that's surprising. It's certainly disturbing, but it's not surprising, because the evidence will show that for years, all Mr. Depp has wanted to do is humiliate Amber, to haunt her, to wreck her career. That's what the evidence will show in his words. That's what he wanted. But he made a mistake bringing this case in Virginia, because you're the people who are going to hear this case. A qualified, prepared jury who respects the First Amendment. And with that, even though we've looked at the article as a whole, I'd like to spend a few minutes looking at the individual statements that were made, just as Depp's side showed you, because I think it's important to do that as well. Can we pull up slide 1, please? Then, 2 years ago, I became a public figure representing domestic abuse, and I felt the full force of our culture's wrath for women who speak out. There's absolutely nothing false about that statement. First of all, the evidence will show that Amber did suffer domestic abuse at the hands of Johnny Depp. And it took many forms. Physical, sure, but also emotional, verbal, psychological abuse. It's all domestic abuse that she suffered at his hands. So that's the truth. But what else is the truth is that on May 27th, 2016, 2 years before this opinion piece was published, Amber walked into a courtroom in California with bruises on her face that were given to her by Johnny Depp on that incident in May 21st, 2016, that Elaine's going to tell you more about. That absolutely were given to her. And she took out a domestic violence restraining order that she obtained from the court in California to protect herself. And she was, of course, a public figure. She was a movie star. She didn't want the paparazzi, the press photos. She got those, of course. Who wants to be photographed with a bruised face walking out of court? She didn't want that, and the evidence will show that. But she was a public figure, and 2 years before she wrote this article, she was a public figure representing domestic abuse. That is 100% true. And try as he might to take it away, Amber's freedom of speech gives her the right to say that. Can we pull up slide 2, please? This is the second statement. I had the rare vantage point of seeing in real time how institutions protect men accused of abuse. Once again, that statement is 100% true. Amber did accuse Johnny of abuse. And she saw how he was protected at the same time that her career took a downturn and that he did everything that he could to try to wreck her career, as the evidence will see. But she accused him of abuse. That statement is true. You don't need to relive every intimate detail of their marriage. You don't need to decide what happened on any individual day of their marriage to determine that the First Amendment protects that statement, because it is true. He wants you to forget that. Don't take the bait. Let's pull up the third statement, please. Now, this statement was in the headline of the online edition of the article. I spoke up against sexual violence and faced our culture's wrath. That has to change. The undisputed evidence in this case will be that Amber did not write these words, did not review these words, did not approve these words. That's how op-eds work. She wrote the article, she didn't write this headline. And for that reason alone, it's not defamatory. But here's the thing, like the first two statements, tragically, it's true. Amber did suffer sexual violence at the hands of Depp. And Ms. Vasquez tried to minimize that and tried to make you think that it's all made up. But it's not. You will hear in the most graphic and horrifying terms about the violence that she suffered. You'll hear that straight from her. She will get on the stand and she will tell you that. It happened. And by taking out that domestic violence restraining order, by obtaining that from the court, she did speak out against it and all the other abuse that she suffered. And she said, enough is enough. I need to protect myself. She didn't want to do that. She didn't want to be forced to get that restraining order, but she did. She spoke out against the abuse by doing that. And the evidence will show that she did face her culture's wrath, perhaps illustrated no more clearly by the fact that she's here today facing this lawsuit brought by an obsessed ex-husband hell-bent on revenge. That's why she's here. That's why she's facing our culture's wrath. And as you consider whether these statements are true, I'd ask you to keep this in mind as well. The evidence will show that in May of 2016, when she obtained the restraining order, Mr. Depp never denied the allegations, and in fact, he signed a statement that Amber hadn't made any false statements for financial gain. He signed a statement saying she hadn't made any false statements. And you'll see that in evidence in this trial. And it was only 2 years later, as his career was in free fall and her career was taking off, that he pounced, that he chose to bring this lawsuit after saying that she hadn't made any false statements. And one thing that you'll be instructed at the end of the trial, but that Mr. Depp's side will try to distract you from, is that any damages that he suffered and any defamation has to flow from that 2018 opinion piece. This case isn't about the statements made in 2016, even though they're true. This case is about the December 2018 opinion piece. That's what the case is about. And I have to say, it's pretty ironic. It's pretty ironic that a piece that briefly discussed Amber moving on from Johnny Depp, that briefly discussed her life experiences after Johnny Depp, is the very vehicle that he uses to try to keep her from moving on, to try to keep her from living that life. Rather than give her her life back, rather than take personal responsibility for his own actions, it's ironic that he uses that piece to do that. But like I said, it's not surprising because you will see clear and graphic evidence of his intentions, dating back years. Now, in 5 or 6 weeks, Elaine or I will get up here at closing argument and we'll remind you what this case is about. We'll remind you that this case is about one piece of paper. Amber's words in this article that wasn't about Depp, wasn't about her marriage, wasn't about her relationship, that it was about life after that. It's about the freedom of speech. It's not about the soap opera that Depp will turn this case into. It's not about who you like better. It's not even about whether you agree with the words that she wrote. It's about her right to speak them. Now, before I sit down, I'd like to briefly discuss some of the damages that Depp alleges in this case, because he can't win the case if he can't show damages. And the evidence will show that he has not suffered 1 cent of damages from this op-ed. Not one. Now, make no mistake, Johnny Depp's reputation is in tatters. His career is in free fall. But it's because of problems that he created, problems that he is responsible for. And he's here in court asking you to blame Amber for them. But it's not Amber's fault. They're from the choices that he made. You'll hear a lot of evidence in this trial about those choices. You'll hear evidence of crushing drug and alcohol abuse. You'll hear evidence of Depp taking more drugs than you can count. You'll hear evidence that before one of the instances of abuse, a cross-country plane flight in May 2014 from Boston to Los Angeles, when he kicked Amber in the back on a private jet. You'll hear evidence that he had had no food for days, that he had used cocaine, that he had had half a bottle of whiskey, that he had had countless Red Bulls and vodkas, that he had taken pills, and on the plane decided to top all that off with 2 bottles of champagne. You'll hear evidence of that. And he blacked out on the plane, and he abused Amber and didn't remember anything about it when he woke up. You'll hear evidence of drug binges with his good friend Marilyn Manson. You'll hear evidence of that 3-day blackout in Australia that Ms. Vasquez tried to minimize and tell you was false. A 3-day blackout in which he abused and sexually assaulted Amber, all because she had the courage to confront him about his drinking. Imagine that. A concerned spouse confronts her husband about his drinking and gets rewarded with that. That is what the evidence will show. That is what happened to my client. That 3-day blackout that led her to be so in fear for her life that she barricaded herself in her room. That same 3-day blackout that kept him from being able to do what he was in Australia to do, which was to film Pirates of the Caribbean 5. His behavior on that trip, both before the blackout and during it, kept him from being a reliable actor. He showed up late to the set, and after that blackout, he was gone from the set for a long time. Now, he did cut off his finger, but the evidence will show my client did not do it. And just imagine this. What Ms. Vasquez is trying to get you to buy is that Amber Heard somehow developed a major league level fastball and cut off his finger with a bottle. You'll see the evidence. You'll see that that doesn't make any sense. And you'll hear from Ms. Heard's experts who testify, including orthopedic hand specialists who testify there was no way that that happened. You'll also see pictures of what Mr. Depp did after he cut off his finger, when he dipped it in blood and paint and wrote graffiti all around the house. That's what you're going to see he did. And you're going to ask yourself, how can someone that is blacked out, how can they deny that they abused someone? How can they deny what they were told that they did? He has no credibility when he gets up here now in this court and tells you he didn't do this or do that when he was blacked out. So just remember that. Those were problems that he created. You'll hear evidence that the same addictions that led him to abuse Amber also led to the demise of his career as an actor. Like I said, as you saw with Disney, the evidence will show with Disney, he was unreliable as an actor, and those same self-destructive tendencies led to financial distress. Quite simply, he was running out of money, and that distress fueled his abusive tendencies toward Amber. And it led the public to think less and less of him. And you will see a parade of witnesses who testify in Johnny's case that all have one thing in common. They all rely on him. They're all on his payroll for the most part, or they rely on him for some sort of luxury in their life. And you'll see that of these witnesses. So in a lot of ways, Amber previewed the parade of witnesses when she said in her op-ed, and I'm going to read from it and quote it here. She said, you remember when I said this, "Imagine a powerful man as a ship, like the Titanic. That ship is a huge enterprise. When it strikes an iceberg, there are a lot of people on board desperate to patch up holes, not because they believe in or even care about the ship, but because their own fates depend on the enterprise." Remember that. as Depp's witnesses take the stand, none of whom know what happened behind closed doors between him and Amber, none of whom can testify to that. But remember that these are people who care about their own financial well-being, just as Amber previewed in that article. And they know what happens to people who stand up to Depp. They know what happens because they've seen it. They've seen it with Amber, and they've seen it with other people in his life who had the courage to ask him to change and who he lashed out against. These are people who helped enable the man who describes himself as the monster. Make no mistake, this man's poor choices have brought him to this courtroom. His own bad behavior, his own refusal to commit to sobriety, his own violence, his poor choices. And the people who have spoken up against it, they're the ones that have suffered the consequences. You'll hear evidence that he fired his longtime agent, that he got rid of his business managers and his law firms that had represented him for years. And no one has suffered from his refusal to take accountability more than Amber Heard. You'll hear evidence that 2 years before the op-ed, 2 years before that, Mr. Depp brought someone else into his life who helped convince him to blame other people. That man, Adam Waldman, who Ms. Vasquez introduced you to, had never met Mr. Depp while he was in a relationship with Ms. Heard, or while he was represented by his agents or his former business managers. But he convinced him that all these bad things that are happening in his life, he helped convince him of this, were other people's fault. And you'll hear evidence of that. Rather than take responsibility for cleaning himself up, Depp chose to blame other people. That's why we're here. And the evidence will show you crystal clearly that the op-ed had nothing to do with damages that he suffered. He's going to try to make it sound like this caused him to lose Pirates of the Caribbean 6, which is a movie that hasn't been made, but that Disney wasn't going to cast him in it because of Amber's article. But there's no evidence of that. The evidence will actually show that months before the op-ed, it was reported that Disney was considering dropping him from Pirates 6. The evidence will show that Disney had a dossier on him that had articles from the press, had other information about Mr. Depp, and they didn't have this article at all in their files. It didn't register with them, just as it didn't register with the public. The public had known since 2016 what Amber had to say about Johnny Depp. This didn't change any of that. The evidence will also show that he said he would not make Pirates 6 even if Disney paid him far more money than he'd ever made on a film. That's what the evidence will show. So any damages that he suffered in his career are not because of this op-ed. And it's time to make Johnny take responsibility, to tell him, Mr. Depp, stop blaming other people for your self-created problems, to take responsibility for your own life. And it's up to you, ladies and gentlemen, to make him do that. It's up to you, because you are uniquely qualified to do that. No one else has the power to do that. Only you, to tell him enough is enough, to stand up for the First Amendment, to stand up for the truth, and Amber's right to speak it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rottenborn.